So, after I published my last video about the hole in government finances that led to the removal of the winter fuel allowance, I received quite a lot of questions of the type of, who continues to lend us money when we're broke? So, I thought it would be useful to tackle this question head on. By the way, I'm wandering around a town in the UK. I wonder if anyone spots any landmarks. You can let me know what it is. But anyway, let's dive into the topic of UK debt and what that means for the UK economy. We'll have a look at some history comparing the UK with some other countries, and we'll also talk about what's happening now. So, for some historical context and the current situation, let's start with a bit of history. So back in 2010, newspapers were full of headlines about the UK running out of money and government debt being out of control. And at that time, government debt was about 50% of GDP. Fast forward to today, government debt has doubled to around 100% of GDP. Now, this makes us wonder, who on earth will continue to lend the UK money? So who is it that buys government debt, and who do we borrow from? In the past 10 years, a third of government debt has been bought by the Bank of England, and which they create money as part of quantitative easing. This is quite unusual, and in theory, they plan to sell all this debt that they bought. However, 75% of the UK's debt is actually bought by private investors, pension funds and private banks in the form of bonds. And anyone who invests for their pension and watches this channel will know that when the stock market struggles, then it's normal to switch some of your investments from equities, shares in companies and the like, to government bonds, debts issued by governments. So what are the factors that influence the UK's ability to borrow? Well, the truth is, the amount a country can borrow depends on many factors like inflation and interest rates and the state of the economy. The idea is that if private sector suddenly spends a lot less in a recession, the government needs to step in to maintain demand and prevent the recession from getting any worse. To put UK debt in historical context, going back hundreds of years, it was actually quite normal to have government debt over 100% of GDP. And in the mid-2000s, we had a period of low government debt, which is really strange, actually. It's what we came to expect. It's a bit like low interest rates at the moment. When I was young, interest rates averaged about 8%, and now they're typically half that. So how do we compare to other countries? The UK isn't alone in having government debt close to 100% of GDP. But it's still nearly double that of many other European countries like Norway and Ireland. The comparison brings up an interesting question though. How come Japan has debt of around 250%? What's the relationship between private pensions, government debt, and economic behaviour during recessions? So private pensions and government debt, let's talk about that. If you've got a private pension, you're probably indirectly buying government debt. We often think of household debt as similar to household getting a loan from a bank. And politicians like to use the phrase of maxing out the nation's credit card. However, another way to think about government debt is more like an extended family, really. So imagine borrowing from a rich grandma. You want to go out and buy a car as a youngster, you don't have sufficient income. Well, you might go to a grandma and get a loan at a relatively low rate of interest, making debt a way to afford a new car. In this case, debt transfers money from the wealthier family member to yourself, you're the poorer family member. So you can achieve this same impact by taxing your rich grandma instead of borrowing from her. But the outcome's quite similar in a way. So what about borrowing from abroad? So in addition to borrowing from domestic sources, the UK also borrows from abroad, and about 25% of the UK debt is bought by overseas investors, such as Chinese private investors. And these see UK debt as relatively safe investments. The UK has never defaulted on its debt, but in theory, Chinese investors could suddenly sell all their UK debt and bring the money back to China. This would be awkward for the UK, and it would likely push up interest rates, but it would also raise the value of the Chinese currency and make Chinese exports more expensive. Now, this would be costly for China. They don't buy UK debt just to do us a favour. So there is something called the paradox of thrift. So let's talk about how recessions occur. So during recessions, people tend to spend less and try to increase their personal savings. Now, John Keynes called this the paradox of thrift. So when an individual decides to save more during a recession, it's entirely rational and logical. If everyone saves more at the same time, it leads to lower spending and a deeper recession. So during recession, the government tries to use these extra savings by selling bonds to those who want to invest in the economy. When households save more, the government borrows more. And let's talk about COVID-19 then and the pandemic. So when private spending collapsed during COVID-19 and people started saving more, this prevented the economy from completely collapsing. Now, if we go back to the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Treasury was actually fixated on balancing the budget. And in response to the Great Depression, they cut in employment benefits and they increased taxes, but this actually just made the recession worse. So what is the relationship between government debt and interest rates? Here we're going to talk about the infamous Liz Truss mini budget. So if inflation is low and economic growth is sluggish, rising borrowing is usually absorbed by the private sector. This is because they want to buy bonds during this period. For example, from 2009 to 2021, UK debt rose considerably and it almost doubled. However, during this period, bond yields fell because there was very high demand for buying debt and bonds. And this was a complication. The central bank was printing money, creating money and buying bonds, which contributed to low bond yields. And essentially, in the 2010s, the economy was stuck with low growth, low inflation, and low private investment. This created a strong demand for government bonds because the private sector didn't want to invest itself. This explains why Japan's government has debt of over 250% of GDP, but bond yields only slightly above zero. Due to the demographics and an aging population, there's a high level of savings and a strong willingness to keep buying government bonds. Also, they don't have much immigration at all. So if it was cheap to borrow and economic growth was weak in the 2010s, why did the government pursue austerity? Well, George Osborne argued that it was necessary to reduce the deficit and bring debt under control. I remember thinking at the time, this kind of makes sense. If you borrow too much, you tighten your belt. However, it doesn't work like that when you're looking at debt for a country. Cuts in public investment and spending contribute to a spiral of lower economic growth and falling investment. This is one reason why austerity had a limited impact on preventing a rise in debt share of GDP, because it stifles growth. So was Liz Truss right to go then for all-out growth? Well, the short answer is that our budget was spectacularly badly timed. In September 2022, there was a resurgence in inflation. When 10% of people don't want to buy bonds with low interest because the real value of bonds decrease. Truss wanted to borrow a lot more just as savings were falling, and there wasn't a demand to buy bonds. When Truss increased borrowing by £90 billion in a single year, the markets knew this would worsen inflation, and therefore interest rates rose very rapidly. Recently, the Bank of England has decided to reverse its course and start selling all the bonds it bought. This has led to a flood of bonds being sold just as the governments wanted to borrow even more. Maybe if trusts had released their budgets in 2010 or 2015 or 2020, then the market reaction may have been different. But when planning a budget and borrowing more, it's crucial to consider the economic circumstances, particularly if you're gambling away the future of your own country. When interest rates were low in the 2010s, borrowing was much cheaper. Often we worry too much about government debt. Fears can be overblown. We can actually relax a bit. However, it's a mistake to say that debt doesn't matter. The economy's not growing like in the UK and you have high interest rates. There's real danger that the debt to GDP ratio can lead to ever higher debt interest payments. And this can create a negative debt spiral, which we definitely want to avoid. It also depends on why you borrow. Additionally, borrowing a lot more during a period of economic growth can crowd out the private sector. When the economy is doing well, the private sector wants to invest in private projects, not government bonds. Politicians often cut taxes during the recession to boost the economy, but they become reluctant to increase them later. So this brings us to the question, is the UK broke? Well, the short answer is no. The UK remains a moderately wealthy country, and debt to GDP is not as alarming as it may first appear. After the Second World War in 1945, debt was around 180% of GDP. Despite this, the government established the welfare state, the National Health Service, and initiated housing projects, a policy that continued through the 50s and 60s. Debt peaked at 235% of GDP in the early 50s. Remarkably, the UK economy didn't collapse under this high debt. Instead, it experienced the best 4 decades of economic growth in its history. As the economy grew, debt as a share of GDP fell, even without significant tax increases. This was largely due to high growth aided by a substantial loan from the US. Unlikely to get that again today. So what about the UK fiscal rules? Well, the rules that the government make for themselves, the fiscal rules, are not particularly helpful. Firstly, they're often more of a headline than a reality, and many things that they declare simply get shelved. Secondly, one way to meet these targets is by cutting investments, which damages the economy in the long term. Thirdly, these targets are not taken seriously by the markets, as forecasts are often overly optimistic about spending and taxes. So hopefully there was some useful thoughts there on how and why we have such high debt levels in the UK and why we shouldn't worry too much about it. But don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. And thanks for listening.